Welcome into another episode of Everything is Logistics, a podcast for the thinkers in freight. I am your host, Blythe Brumleve, and we are presented by SPI Logistics. And in this episode today, I want to bring you a conversation that we had back in August at the ECC Supply Chain Forum. This was a special talk that was done in part for the Engineering and Construction Contracting Association. And it's been around for about 50 years, this association, and they hold this annual conference all across the country. It's for owners, contractors, suppliers, and academics in the engineering and construction business. And so at this conference, they had, obviously everybody has been dealing with supply chain issues over the last sort of handful of years. And so coming back into this year, it's how is everybody planning their capital projects right now? How are they planning them for in the future? What struggles are they currently dealing with? And this is really important for my audience because most of you listening are logistics service providers. So your brokers, your carriers, you are folks trying to get the business of folks like at this conference. And so in this conversation, I'm moderating a panel with Phil Stephenson. He is the Vice President and Chief Transformation Officer over at Avail Infrastructure Solutions. And then we have Fred Mudge. He is the Vice President of Strategic Sourcing over at Powell Electrical Systems. And so both of these gentlemen, both on the shipper side of things, and their insight and their experience, I believe, can help give the folks of Everything is Logistics, give you guys an inside look of how shippers are dealing with their own supply chain problems. And then hopefully you can learn a thing or two and it will help you sell better in the future, whether it's to a construction audience or to your current shippers in the market. So big thanks to the ECC for having me out to moderate this panel. It was a fantastic time. And also big thanks to Phil and Fred for a great discussion. Hope y'all enjoy. Before we get started with the talk, we have a poll question that we are going to toss it to the audience, and hopefully you can help us, get some results for this. But over the past 3 years, has your company been most challenged by supply chain constraints related to materials, logistics, human resources, or if you're one of the unicorns, no issues, my supply chain has been impeccable for the last 3 years? If you could do us a favor and answer that poll question, then I think we'll ask you guys. How would you answer this question?
I think for me it would be materials. It's a hard tie between materials and human resources, and there's alternates to the human resources. You can use contract labor, you can subcontract sub-assemblies, but no matter what, I was told decades ago, when it's materials and you're building, you're at either 100% or you're at zero, right? Having 95% of the material you need to build something, it's still going to ship it short, or it may not be functional. So I think there's other variables with, AI bots and things that can help with the human resources, but you can't overcome materials. Fred, about you?
Yeah, I'd echo that. I'd say both materials and human resources. I'd elevate human resources a little bit just because of the sheer time that you have to invest in staying and coordinated with our suppliers.
And for that 3% that answered with no issues whatsoever, we would like to invite you to pull up a chair because you're one of the very rare people
Right.
that has no supply chain issues, which is great. So hopefully we can hear from you later on in the discussion to hear how you are combating and not having any issues. But let's go ahead and start with the first section of this conversation, and that's around materials. Let's talk about market conditions and lead times. How are the current global supply chain disruptions affecting lead times for critical materials? Phil, you just talked about how you're at 100% or you're at zero. What about the global supply chain itself? How is that affecting your shipments?
It's affecting everything, especially as you look at it more from a true supply chain and not just at your individual supplier, and you're trying to delve down into why so many of your suppliers are delayed, right? Which is just that compounding kind of lead time scenario. We're healthier than we were, I'd say, during COVID and post-COVID, but it's still kind of held together with duct tape and chewing gum and maybe a little bit of luck wizards. But there's a lot of fragility in it. But you got to communicate with your suppliers. and be proactive and have that communication both ways to understand anticipating changes in your business world so that they can anticipate those changes and plan ahead of them. And I think that's the biggest way to combat just the lead time of the old procurement of I'm going to look in my system, it says it's 16 weeks, and I'm going to cut you a PO 16 weeks and 1 day ahead of that and expect it to show up. It's not going to happen anymore.
What about Fred? What are you experiencing?
I think for us, we had a little bit of false sense of security in that our business has never chased low-cost countries, and our supply chain is 93% plus all North American. But when you go level 2 and 3 down below that, a lot of our suppliers were dependent on that, and really made us push a lot farther into their supply chains and mandating stock levels and inventory positions that they have. But it truly was a learning experience, but I think it's made all of our supply chain a lot better. So.
What about on the customization side of things, which can greatly impact lead times? How are you combating that or setting those proper expectations and communicating that to your suppliers and customers?
Well, it definitely goes both ways. I mean, historically, we've had a lot of customers come to us and say, we want supplier A because this site is all supplier A product. And we've had to have the conversations around flexibility with, if your project timeline is really dependent or important to the success of the overall project, we need to be a little more flexible and look at potentially some other suppliers that can deliver a little bit closer to that timeline.
I think from the customization standpoint, right, is in both of our businesses are primarily ETO, and I think all my 35 years in manufacturing have all been in engineered to order products. And I mean, you can offset that in some ways, right? There's offsetting levers with you having safeties and other suppliers having safeties, but I think some of the ways that we've also tried to combat it is going into platform type manufacturing, so where you've got 80% of the product's going to be the same, and there's 20% variation in it. So the automotive world started it years ago. I think we're seeing that matriculate into more and more industries just so that you can keep that common core of 60 to 80% material, and then you only have to deal with the anomalies of the 20% that you got to go wrestle.
And so how are you approaching, I guess, that exception management? Are there any strategies that you've implemented to help with that?
Communication. There's a lot of things that can help, right? As we talked about, there's technologies that's coming into place with middlewares that you can put that allows your supply chain professionals to go spend more time dealing with that exception management, because the task of cutting a PO or putting an order acknowledgement in the ERP or even updating lead times in the system, they're all kind of done through the middleware system. So it's really, I think I said best yesterday in the AI conference, AI is not going to replace people. It's going to enhance the values that you hired these people for, because they're not doing tasks that are below their knowledge level, right? And I think once we unlock that potential by taking away these mundane tasks, you can conquer some of these things that used to be really challenging because you were doing it in your spare time, if you will.
What about on the customization side of things? How are you getting those custom products and having the flexibility to get those custom products without sacrificing quality? Fred, I'll go to you.
It really comes back to being nimble on the engineering side, and with, like I said earlier, if we have to seek out multiple suppliers, understanding what their components are and how they go along with the overall design. I think one of the other things that Phil just touched on too is our internal systems. I'll say, pre-pandemic, they were almost on autopilot. Suppliers didn't change their lead times that often. We had a real good handle on when you started to talk about a project, what the timeline of that project was going to be. And I'll make an example here, and Phil will know what I'm talking about, and a lot of you guys will too, but something as simple as a panel board, right? And I grew up in that world. Any manufacturer's making hundreds, if not thousands, of panel boards in a day or a shift. they went over 50 weeks. And, we can build a, 5 to 10,000 square foot building in less than that. So there's a lot of those things that our internal systems were really working against us, and we spent a lot of time, human capital, around maintaining our systems so we were able to give valid information to customers.
And Phil, we've talked a lot, especially at this conference, about low offshoring versus nearshoring, how that approach is shifting over the last handful of years. There's definitely been a much more of a move towards nearshoring. How are you sort of combating, the local versus global supply chain or sourcing?
Well, I've really put the focus in the directives that I'm putting out is to kind of do a parallel effort, right? I mean, we already know that there's constraints around human resources here in North America. There's constraints around capital equipment. If anybody's tried to buy a robotic brake press or a robotic laser, they'll see that the lead times are just ridiculous. And so we're doing a parallel source. And so I tried to qualify, and I give you a really great example when I was at Wellbuilt. If anybody ever had to buy microchips and had to live through the Chipageddon during post-COVID, it was the most nightmarish thing I've ever dealt with. I still have ulcers nicknamed after some of those companies. But we actually took a 7.1-inch user interface that went on all of our fryers and ice machines and conveyor ovens, convection ovens, high-speed microwave ovens, and we sourced it out of China, out of Taiwan, out of Mexico, and out of Germany. And we were doing that because the brokers and the chip brokers were kind of geographically located, right? And so we were getting our best exposure to the market. And if let's say Jabil out of Mexico could get the chips and they didn't require a board spin, they could send us boards. And then if our supplier out of Germany says, hey, I can't get this particular microcontroller, we're going to do a board spin, I could still have somebody else producing somewhere. So it's creating those parallel pathways and trying to find people that can reach into different markets, into their own local markets, has allowed us to kind of overcome some of these tasks that we thought were just going to be impossible.
That's interesting. You meant parallel partnerships? Is that what you mentioned?
Yes, absolutely.
Nice. Okay, Fred, what about you? You are more on national sourcing, correct? Your company, and
right.
What are some of the challenges around? Has that evolved at all as more companies are starting to also locally source?
It has, but again, we're primarily North American dependent, and one of the things that I'll say that we didn't see coming is some of the spin up of the level of spend that we're seeing today. I mean, some of the larger projects that we see today, we used to call mega projects. That term is used for much bigger projects now. But that level of spend around data centers and all that kind of thing, our entire supply chain, I would say, was not necessarily prepared for that. But one of the things that we continue to push on our supply base is, and it goes back to a statement one of my people I learned from a long time ago is, expect to be surprised and be ready to seize the opportunities. And we push that on our suppliers, and some of our suppliers are private companies, and it's their own pocket that they're reaching into to get the money. But we keep pushing them to be ready to expand, whether it's buildings, equipment, and all that kind of thing, because it's our industry, for lead times for us, they're longer projects, right? But we push them on a much faster cycle to be able to be prepared to deliver, something that we may not actually need for 6 months or 4 months or something like that.
But I still think you're going to find the unknown. I mean, just recently with all the data center increases, copper run on allocation and the price spiked, and then even if you can't get copper, right, you can't find anybody silver flash it. So right. I think we collectively as an industry and all the different industries need to have better communications through those channels in advance of just saying, I'm just going to suck down all the copper in the world.
Right. It's a surprise every week. So.
Are you in freight sales with a book of business looking for a new home? Or perhaps you're a freight agent in need of a better partnership? These are the kinds of conversations we're exploring in our podcast interview series called The Freight Agent Trenches, sponsored by SPI Logistics. Now, I can tell you all day that SPI is one of the most successful logistics firms in North America who helps their agents with back office operations such as admin, finance, IT, and sales, but I would much rather you hear it directly from SPI's freight agents themselves. And what better way to do that than by listening to the experienced freight agents tell their stories behind the how and the why they joined SPI. Hit the freight agent link in our show notes to listen to these conversations, or if you're ready to make the jump, visit spi3pl.com.
All right, I think we have another poll question ready to toss up on the screen. If you guys could throw that up there for us and get your app ready to vote on it. Because we expect a healthy debate around this one. So has your company or your client utilized the holding a spot strategy for procuring long lead materials? So if you guys could answer those for us really quick, we are going to probably have a larger debate around this in just a few minutes, and we'll use the results for that. But let's get into it, sort of the logistics side of things really quick. Whether geopolitical or port congestions, Fred, how are you approaching supply chain challenges? I mean, I imagine you're not really worried about a lot of that because you're North American based.
True, but especially when it comes to our inbound freight, we're having to pay much more attention to that than we ever have. It's whether you have all the parts or you can't ship because you're waiting on one. We've put in place a lot of relationships with 3PLs from a tracking standpoint, understanding what the incoming flow of materials is to us. We're not as dependent on that when it comes to outbound freight.
What about you, Phil? How are you approaching these disruptions? Because I imagine it's impacting.
Oh, well, it's impacting everybody, right? And it typically just impacts you hardest in margin erosion because, as Fred said, you're going to get partial shipments and you're going to make the decision from a fiduciary standpoint to air freight some stuff, maybe from somewhere crazy in the planet, to make the job shipments. But I think, again, you can start to tie in technology to kind of offset some of this stuff as well, right? So that there's not opportunities for missed bookings on trucks on the inbound, and we've taken a bigger stance as far as my current organization and actually managing some of the inbound for critical items versus we never thought about that before. It was just you didn't have to worry about it. As Fred said, you'd cut the PO, you were pretty good on the lead time. It typically would show up a day or two prior. Wasn't damaged, but now as critical components can just stack up and shut your factory down, you have to take a little bit more control of that logistics, just for the confidence standpoint.
Well, in my industry, logistics, for folks who may not be aware, that technology has just come onto the scene with just full force. We've historically used a lot of the same systems for decades, but within the last 5 to 7 years, it's really been so much new technology, most of them being around visibility and tracking. Are some of these solutions helping you guys?
They are, but I think they're almost also hurting the industry a little bit, right? I mean, there was a lot of truckers didn't like to have 7 cameras on them.
Right.
They didn't like to have a GPS on them that knew their every move, right? So we lost. I mean, that cost us some driver capacity just because they didn't like those aspects of being controlled. But I think it does put confidence in place with the GPS tracking and having confidence after all the missed deliveries that we received for 3 or 4 years of knowing that, hey, when the breaker's supposed to be there, it's going to show up, right? And it's already waited 52 weeks for it. You'd think, what's another day? But it's you've got 1,000 or 2,000 people in a factory ready to put this thing together and get it out to the job site.
Well, Fred, how has technology or logistics technology maybe helped or provided some challenges?
I think it's definitely helped from a visibility standpoint. And you have conversations with suppliers, and they say, I can't believe we're having this conversation. We've already shipped it, and it's on the way. And that to some degree used to be good enough, but we're so tight in needing some of these parts, and in some of the common parts, we've been able to build inventory, and it's not that big of a deal. But on project-specific material, it's a huge deal.
What about sticking with technology and sort of geopolitical issues that are popping up? Is there software that also helps you mitigate those or assess those risks across the globe? I mean, in our discussions yesterday, Fred, you mentioned a new Canadian tariff that was just put on or just implemented. And so is software helping to alert you to those issues, or is it really just fall back to the human side of things and the communicating that to you that, hey, this is coming, you might want to position your shipments a little bit differently?
It would be nice. The quick answer is no. I mean, using the Canada example, this week Canada put a 25% tariff on materials from China, and it's the same tariff, or it sounds like the same tariff that the U.S. put in a few years ago. But again, it causes us to go back to our supply base and understand what are some of our alternatives with suppliers that we do have a good relationship with. If they're not able to do that, how do we find alternate suppliers that are going to be able to keep us in position from a cost standpoint? The other part to that, and you guys probably have the answer to this one, is it's not just an increase in price on the Chinese material. The other manufacturers are going to see that as an opportunity. They're going to raise their cost as well. So it is going to be something that we didn't expect. Nobody said, hey, we're evaluating this, hang on, in 3 months or 12 months we're going to put this in place. It was something from our standpoint we didn't see coming.
And then Phil, you had mentioned yesterday in our discussions, trying to circumvent aluminum shortages and copper, and especially because of the Ukraine-Russia war. So are those I guess risks still happening? I mean, obviously the war is still going on, but...
So yeah, obviously those risks are still present. And I think everybody throughout the entire supply chain is bearing a little of that risk, right? And I think with making commitments and firm commitments, and the way we've worked with some of our suppliers is we've maybe, and Fred, I'm sure you guys have done it as well, made some rather ambitious volumes of aluminum that we'll be receiving. But I mean, we've made the commitment to say if we don't take it in a year, we'll go ahead and procure it from you. But it's I don't see any of these problems going away for the next decade, and so I think everyone's going to have to take some of that, cash solvency, risk avert, inventory risk, and bear it a little bit, or else you're going to find yourself in a really bad situation.
And so, I mean, I don't want to say I'm speaking of really bad situations, but we're going to talk about the holding the slot concept. If we could reveal those poll results, please. And then I know that you guys said it was going to be a drag-down fight between the two of you of debating this topic. So I'm interested to hear how you are approaching this. And has your company or your client utilized the holding a spot strategy for procuring long lead materials? First, maybe Phil, you can kind of highlight why this is a little bit of a controversial topic.
Well, it would be great if people actually held to the spot, and that's the problem. When we're dealing in this environment where you have pretty rapid turnover with manpower, there's a struggle to get materials, and then you're running your sales and inventory and operations plan to schedule a 7,000-hour project that probably is not going to come to fruition, or it's going to get delayed 3 months, or if I do build it, I'm going to end up being housed with it, and then I've just got all my cash tied up into something that's not moving. And then I've got another hot job for somebody that's actually got an infrastructure project that they're trying to get the utility upgraded, and it's all tied up in a piece of equipment that's sitting out not being utilized. So I'm not a fan of it at all. I think these projects are not short-term projects, especially when we look at some of these larger infrastructure projects. It's communicate, and just hold to what you say you're going to do. And I know, Fred, you guys have dealt with the same issues at Powell.
Well, I'm a little bit more of a fan than Phil is, because it does drive the communication. And my experience with people that are looking to put a purchase order in to hold a slot or engineering only and that kind of thing, it really happens most often because you don't really know what you need at that point, right? There's other ways to probably get a little bit further down the road without injury to either party. Whether you're talking about a master service agreement where you can at least get a little bit ahead of that, understand what the project looks like. You can get terms, out there in front of everybody and understand, Are there terms that we're going to be able to accept versus a full flow down from the overall project? A lot of those kinds of things you can get worked out far in advance. Where it comes back to harm a manufacturer, as Phil was saying, is if we lock down a particular slot, it impacts other customers. And I've probably in close to 40 years, I've probably seen one or two projects that actually follow the timeline that we commit to when we're saying we're going to hold a slot. And it really hurts the production schedule that's behind that hold a slot when things don't happen on that time schedule. We do have flexibility in our operations. They're big enough we can kind of move some things around. But it gets back to, we play a game internally we call paper dolls, where we start to lay things out on the production floor and say, okay, but what if this doesn't hit for 2 weeks or 2 months? What other projects is that going to impact? So again, tagging on to what Phil talked about, the communication up front is huge. And the more that we can have of that and understanding what's the project really look like, what are the, if we get to an engineering only PO, we can start doing that work. It starts to take shape. And then we've got a lot more things we can plan from.
And I would say adding to that, right, is slight project moves are not a big deal, right? But recently there's been further delays to where you're seeing big electrical projects pushing out years.
Absolutely.
And when you're in partial complete, I mean, you really, as a manufacturer, that's the worst thing ever, is to leave something partially built, push it away. I mean, any good manufacturer is going to finish it, right? Follow your SOPs, maintain the quality to make sure that there's not going to be any sacrifices in that. So you're really just putting a big risk on your supplier from a cash flow standpoint, from a space standpoint, from a capacity standpoint. And look, if you don't know something's moving in 2 years, 4 months before it's supposed to ship, then there we have another communication problem throughout the entire industry, right?
Yeah, and it could be a really bad thing, from a manufacturing standpoint is, if you're talking about multiple buildings from our standpoint or multiple lineups of switchgear, a lot of times we'll tell you, look, your first building or your first lineup of switchgear has to leave before the next one hits the floor. And really that's protecting our revenue stream to be able to be sure that your project that all of a sudden gets locked up for an additional year or more doesn't, grow roots in our factory floor and, keep us from servicing other customers and hitting our financial mandates.
Brokering success demands a battle-ready strategy. TIE TMS equips freight brokers with the ultimate battle station for conquering a tough market. With TIE, brokers gain access to a comprehensive platform where rate intelligence and quote history converge on a single screen. It's not just a page, it's a strategic command center designed to help brokers win. TIE equips your team with all of the data they need to negotiate with confidence and allows them to communicate directly with carriers and customers from a simple control base. Revolutionize the way your brokers perform by giving them a competitive advantage with TIE TMS. For more info, go to tai-software.com/battle stations, and we also have a link for you in the show notes to sign up for a demo.
So if you had a magic wand to fix your logistics operations or the logistics side of your companies, what would be one thing that you wish you could just wave a magic wand and it would be solved?
Having the perfect supply chain, right? Everything to be in sync with one another and, having the capacity across that entire supply chain. And it's, for a long, long time, within our industry, it worked really, really well. Today, with the gross changes from, our sub-supplier to sub-supplier, it's made it really difficult from a lead time standpoint. And I will say, and I was having a conversation earlier this morning, there's a lot of people in our supply base that are out there working really hard. And everybody in our industry knows that everybody's going to get in the ditch, right, from time to time. The secret is how fast you can get out of the ditch.
Right.
And unfortunately, there's a lot of people in this industry that have been in the ditch for 2-3 years. We've got great relationships across our supply base. We're sharing a lot of strategies and tactics across our sub-suppliers to help them out of the ditch. There's a lot of money being spent to increase capacity and getting new equipment and that kind of thing. And my guess, if I made one prediction in 2 or 3 years, there's going to be way more capacity than we're going to be using. It's going to take 2 or 3 years to get there.
Ebbs and flow of the industry. Phil, what about you? What would be a magic wand to answer to fixing logistics and materials?
Abiding by commitments. It just ebbs and flows, and it just sends ripples, right? It's imagine throwing the big rock in the pond. Well, one big project move hits Fred or I or whoever you're buying from. They've got 1,400 suppliers. Those 1,400 suppliers have got 2,800 suppliers, right? Every single one of them is impacted. And we're too fragile to recover from it. And you just keep taking these really small ticks against the whole supply chain, and it just continues to erode it. I mean, you guys all seen it, right? I used to buy from this company no longer exists. I used to buy from this company. Well, now this company's owned by that company. The people can't survive, especially the smaller players in the supply chain can't survive those continued small impacts that just erode the infrastructure of their business. And then that just collapses it even further.
And so I guess, it's a very challenging thing to consistently be able to address and consistently be able to try to problem solve, which, considering all of that, we're about to talk about human resources side of things, which adds a whole new complexity to this. But before we do that, we have another poll question related around supply chain technology. If we could throw that up on the screen. Has your company or your client implemented an impactful technology upgrade to supply chain management systems? So this is logistics, materials, or warehouse management, maybe a TMS system. And then we have a few different answers there. If you guys could go ahead and answer those for us, and then we will reveal the results in just a few minutes. But speaking of the human resources side of things, labor is arguably harder to source than materials. So let's talk about getting applicants first through the door and qualified in each of your companies. Phil, I'll start with you.
Oh, it's been a challenge. I mean, one is getting the applicants, 2 is getting them processed through, and 3 is getting them to stay past the first lunch break on the first day. I mean, I think there was a whole mental shift post the pandemic that people just didn't have loyalty. I mean, you can see you're trying to backfill a very aged, talented workforce. Right? I mean, 2022, there were 17% of the people that left the skilled labor retired. So for every one of those, you're not going to bring in some 22-year-old person out of tech school that's going to replace them. I mean, that retired welder forgot more that day than that guy's going to know for the next 5 years, right? And so I think the biggest problem that people are having is they're seeing that, and you see it in a lot of organizations. I've worked for Dover and Well-Built, where we had 50,000 employees, and they all calculate that headcount requirement as a 1, right? It's a 1 or a 0, but they're not all. They're so dynamic, right? I could bring in 5 welders that might not do the work of this one guy that retired after 45 years. And so I think where we're trying to start working around that is that kind of value of that employee and their onboarding and taking away stupid tasks and making sure that the work's clear. And it's starting to take ground. But I can tell you, last year we had some really stupid stats we had one particular business that had hired 353 direct labor employees, and we retained like 103. So, I mean, you think about that from how that's eroding your cost. You train up this guy for 2 months, and then they're gone, and then there's another one to train, and then maybe they leave. It's very difficult, and it's, the whole time there's somebody in scheduling or there's somebody in operation that's looking at that human being as a 1 number. I need to have a head count of 350, and I'm at 345. Well, it's far more dynamic than that, and I think people need to realize that a lot more often, that it is super impactful. The quality level of the people that you're bringing in is directly related to how well you're doing from a sourcing standpoint to bring in the right people. there's every business is not right for everyone, and everyone's not right for every business. And I think the more that recruiters and human resources and operation funnel that to where you can find the right person for the right role, and you bring them in and you have flawless onboarding, and they quickly become into the culture of the organization and it's safe, we can kind of stop this whole whirlwind of people starting and stopping and quitting and moving for $1 an hour.
Yeah, it sounds like a revolving door.
It is.
With applicants. Fred, are you experiencing the same things?
Yeah, our numbers are almost identical, and it's not that we're staying static either, right? It's not we're trying to replace one for one. There's a growth mode in that as well that compounds, the need for people. One of the things that we've started to do is start to understand and talk to people across our entire organization around, what are some of the flexibility things that we can do. So we're running a pilot in one of our plants now where we've started a weekend shift similar to what, the nursing industry's done for decades. And we run a Friday, Saturday, Sunday, 12-hour day shift. It's tough as a manufacturing person on the shop floor, being there 12 hours. But it's allowed us to grow in a market that hasn't been available in that area before. And there's a good group of folks there that like it. It's somewhat of a rural area. There's a lot of people there that farm. If they're saying, heck yeah, I can go work and get benefits for 3 days, and I can go do my other things for 4 days, it fits with their lifestyle a little bit better than saying, no, you're going to be here 5 days. Hasn't solved the problem, but it's helped.
What about retention? I would imagine those different options would help with retention as well.
We see a gap. So like Phil was saying, there is an outflow from a manufacturing standpoint. We've recently celebrated several folks in our business that have 50 years of service, and they're leaving. Our average tenure, when I started with our company, 18 years ago, was in the 20 to 22 year range. It's down to about 7 or 8.
Wow.
And part of it is the growth, but part of it is attracting new folks into the business.
And so when it comes to that skilled labor and focusing on the retention of that skilled labor, are there any strategies, or is it just it just comes out of nowhere because the employee is ready to move on, but replacing that skilled labor? Phil, I think you mentioned, trying to get 5 people to do the job of one experienced person. How do you combat that?
Well, we were very honest with our employees, and we asked them, those that were there for a while, why do you like working here? And those that would turn over, we would ask them why you didn't want to be here. And it's it's no mystery that there's different people that have different mindsets. I mean, 2022, right, coming out of the pandemic, 14% of the workforce decided they no longer wanted to work for an employer. They wanted to be part-time or through skilled contract. There's a lot of things that are moving. So as you take that data in and gather that data and then work with the employees and the staff, and you make some crazy changes. Like Fred will tell you, we've got a factory that's in Missouri, and we've had that factory for 45 years, and it's never been air conditioned. It was one of the biggest complaints. So it's really freaking hot in Missouri in the summer, so we air condition it. And it's amazing how much different the people reacted to that. And I mean, you'll see, one hourly guy's holding the next guy accountable because if he rolled up a door to drive a fork truck out of it, he's like, you need to close that door, right? Close the door. I mean, we've invested a lot of money to keep ourselves comfortable, and we're going to work. So it's you really just got to talk to the people. I think every geographic region is going to have different things, but the old traditional pizza party's not doing it, right? It's about increasing their skill. It's about providing them with values to make them a more valuable employee. It's the stupid old diatribe is, well, what if I invest all this time in this employee and they leave? And it's, well, what if you don't invest the training into them and they stay, right? So just invest. You can't worry about the risk, and things change. People change. People want different stuff. Just listen to the voice of your employees, and you can get retention. And I think it's not just in the DNA of the American worker like it used to be, that, hey, I'm loyal, I come to work, I work hard, and I earn my dollar and I go home. That's not the society we're dealing with anymore.
With coming up with different solutions, whether it is, having a 3-day work week or some of these other things that you guys have talked about, what about the upskill factor? Is it regularly communicating and figuring out how that employee wants to upskill? How are you offering them, those additional, I guess, benefits to the job that they can learn more and grow?
Well, we mentioned a lot about the shop floor. I mean, it's all the way through the business. And, if I go back even, pre-pandemic, probably 7-8 years ago, we started trying to understand how we better interrelate to customers and project type business. And we really started to talk to engineers and salespeople and all that kind of thing. And there was a disconnect we saw in our business around project management. And it was really something we started to evolve within our business, where that's really the path that a lot of people take. And we had a lot of engineers that held up their hand and said, I love to be an engineer, but I hate it when the phone rings and somebody's got a question, right? Which that question oftentimes is important to the project, but they're so locked into going after the next one. So, we've gotten a large group of project management professionals throughout the group today. That is what they live for. And, they love it from the interaction with the customers. They love it because they go across our entire business and they touch each piece of our business.
Bill, how about you?
I think a lot of it resonates to Fred's responses. There's very traditional methods of doing skills matrix, but the reality of it comes down to is incentivize people for the habits you want them to have, right? So if I need to upskill my workforce, but there's no incentive in it for them, it's not going to happen, right? There's different tiers, there's different ways of people going, well, I'm a welder 1, a welder 2, welder 3, welder 4. But I mean, we've started looking at different groups to be able to create tiger teams, right, that could come in and really work on anything where you get a 2.5x multiplier if you're also trained and certified on the electrical as well as on welding. And so, people don't come to work just because they really like hanging out with you, right? They do it because they really expect to see some money landing in the bank account. And so if you incentivize them in a meaningful way, and they see value in that, and they see that they're investing in themselves, and they become a more valuable assets to themselves and to their families, upskilling is not really that hard.
Now, we've talked about how, sort of technology has impacted the materials and the logistics side of things. What about human resources? I would imagine that it's just more technology. Is there such a thing as too much tech when it comes to the human side of things?
You got to have the human aspect, but you can never have too much data. All right, a good decision with bad data and a bad decision with good data look exactly the same. You're both getting unemployed, right? Somebody's going to get hurt. So I think you got to have the human aspect to be able to make the good decisions, but you got to have good data, and you got to have volumes of data. Small samplings of data don't give you enough to create the trends that you're going to be able to make proper reactions off of. So, yeah, I think the technology's there. I think using the data properly, especially never using the data as like a whipping piece to your workforce. But if you have the data and you teach people to make good decisions, you'll kind of have that reciprocal workforce that continues to kind of build back to that 25, 30-year tenures that was so common here in the U.S. market, right?
Fred, what about you?
Yeah, and I'd say one of the things Phil touched on earlier, on the shop floor again, robotic press brake. That's a great thing, and you used to have people that wanted to be skilled and be a press brake operator, and they knew the correct tooling, and they could read a drawing, and they could figure out where the first bend was to be made on a flat piece of metal. Today, you can buy a machine that does all that, and you've really got, rather than an operator, you've got an observer. But when things go wrong, they don't really know how to fix it. So there are ways to get there. But then you get to a sticking point because they're not really educated on the true craft, if you will. You go farther in the organization, like the project manager I talked about earlier, yeah, there's a lot of data available to that person, but it's truly not technology. They've got to actually do the job.
And so we've talked about a lot of different, each of these different sections, from the materials to the logistics to the human resources side of things. We could have spent an entire talk on that, but I think we're going to move into Q&A. So if you have any questions around those three topics, we would love to hear from you. Just be sure to use the app, or we do have roaming mics that will be around to be able to ask the questions, and the panelists will be able to answer. Lubna?
Is this on? All right.
Yes.
So we do have a number of really good questions that have been coming through the app. So I'll go ahead and start with this one. What is the most critical message you can deliver to an owner to help improve their project outcomes?
Oh, that's yours.
Come with the question again. There's an echo. I apologize, actually.
Let me shift here. What is the most critical message you can deliver to an owner to help improve their project outcome?
Ooh. That's a tough one. Yeah.
I'll take it first.
Yeah.
So we talked a lot about communication, and it's both ways. And one of the things that we preach, like I said, to our project management groups is they're our customers' eyes and ears inside of our buildings, right? And if we sense a problem, let's talk about it. It may not materialize, but the more information that you have on an ongoing basis, the better the project goes. And I think one of the things too, and I honestly personally drives me nuts is when we're finished with a project, and folks show up to a factory acceptance test with a list of changes that we want to make. Right. That's a bad day in our office. We can make any change. We're much better prepared to make it through the project than at the end. And the worst thing we can do is ship a project where we have to come to the field and make those changes in the field. So again, it kind of goes back to what we talked about from a communication standpoint.
That's kind of adding to that, right, is adding some good processes in the organization, right? Hour by hour boards, day by day boards, just to make sure that, if I'm supposed to be at 65% complete in manufacturing, am I at 65% complete, right? And that's another area where adding technology in Blythe is going to kind of change that, because, traditionally that's all done very manual, but you still kind of want it to be manual because it opens up that opportunity for the workforce to talk to the leaders, to the supervisors, to the management, and it tiers up. But being able to transfer it into digital data that you can actually have customer portals even for your customers, right? And that's something that we ask for with a lot of our suppliers is portals in. Let me see what your inventory is. Let me see what your production status is on my equipment. And then so it's kind of this self-serve market. So I guess to whoever asked that question, rather than me having to tell someone that there's confidence in their job, that they can self-serve and look right into my system and see, hey, what's the status of it? Do I have all the materials? Do I have the staffing? Are we at the percentage of completion that we should be in? Is really, I think, where the future of this will go, so that you don't have to really do these mundane conversations.
And it sounds like it'll save a bunch of phone calls, too, if you have some of these customer portals available. All right, next question.
All right, we've got our second question is, do you have any rules of thumb when reading a supplier's lead time in our current environment to set realistic expectations for your projects or your clients? Or methods to go deeper to understand the risks? Oh, it just disappeared. To understand the risks of your project, to your project.
So, yeah, there's no substitute for communication, right? And when I'm working with my suppliers, I like to understand for those guys where they're putting their risk, where they're putting their cash. I actually also like to kind of ask them, hey, what does your customer base look like, and what does your supplier's customer base look like? Because I try to avert risks. I can give you a great example where I have one of the best suppliers. They have never missed a single delivery, and that is the culture of that organization. But they were awarded this bid because of one single statement. I asked them, how big would my company be in relationship to your annual revenue. And they said, well, you're just the right size because we never allow any customer to be greater than 1.5% of our annual revenue. So what does that tell you, right? That tells me that great culture that this organization has, that they pride themselves on, high tenured employees, delivering on time and taking care of their customers, that there's no single client that they have that can sway that culture. And I think you really got to have those communications, and you got to have that transparency with your supplier base. The days of just, I'm going to cut you a PO, you send me an acknowledgement, and hopefully your stuff shows up at the dock. Those are long gone. I mean, when I get into a commodity discussion with a group of potential suppliers, we're discussing 17, 18, 19 aspects, and it's not the legalese terms. I just want to know how we're going to do business, right? You think about sports teams. They don't show up on the field and just go, hey, Fred, which position you play in, right? Everybody knows what we're going to do. They know the rules. And we try to generate rule books and playbooks with our suppliers to say, here's just what I expect, right? And we hold each other accountable. Every month and every quarter we say, here's how I think you're treating me as a supplier. Now, I want your honest feedback on how I'm treating you as a customer. And so it allows us to evolve and adapt, but you just got to get past the price and when it's going to be here and, oh, you're a day late, so let me slap you on the hand. Because guess what? You're going to get inherently worse lead times from that supplier that you treat like that, right? So if you want good lead times, treat them with respect. Treat them as a relationship and know what their strategies are and how their strategies align with your strategies. And if you can get cultural alignment, I find with your suppliers that they're really never late. And if they are, you know way before it's going to impact you.
And I'd say it, to some degree it varies, right? If you're talking about a raw material supplier, a whole lot easier to manage a raw material supplier if you have stocking programs with them and that kind of thing. If you're going to order a catalog item, a whole lot simpler. I mean, you do want to have a relationship with them and understand what stocking levels they typically have and that kind of thing, so you can build the confidence. But if it's an assembled product supplier, you've got to be in there with them. You've got to understand where they are from their supply chain standpoint, where are their manpower issues. They're dealing with the same things we are. They're dealing with the same churn of people. Some of them are doing some offshore engineering today. It's great from a capacity standpoint, may not be all that great from a quality standpoint. So you have to learn that. And every supplier is going to be different. And one of the things we mentioned earlier that makes it even more difficult is that, where you had a stronger relationship with a supplier A, where the majority of your spend went, but they're in the ditch, right? And you've got to be with B and C today. You've got to have those relationships there, and you've got to know who's going to give you the true answer. And there's some large organizations out there that we deal with from a supply base standpoint. Some are better than others at either the information that they have or the information they're willing to share. And those are the risk discussions that we have a lot of, from our project management and our buying community and that kind of thing. And it's not fun for you guys. It's not fun for us when we're having these joint conversations around who's your supplier, I want to go see them, and all that kind of thing. That's where the real disruption comes in.
Next question.
All right. What strategies and best practices are companies employing to enhance cyber resilience in their supply chains? And how can organizations effectively de-risk their operations against potential cyber attacks?
Good question.
Right. We are I'd say from my organization, we're in a learning phase of that. And from an IT standpoint, it's gone from the guys that sat over in a dark corner to making sure you had all the information that you needed to make decisions, to where they're really out front in a protection mode. Talking about cyber attacks, we've had more internally driven phishing emails come through the organization, trying to educate ourselves on what we do to protect ourselves, what we do to protect our supply base, and those kinds of things. So it's, I can say that we've had, I can think of 4 sub-suppliers that have been impacted by cyber attacks. One of them was pretty devastating to their business because they had to go back a long time and recreate a lot of data. And I think that was probably 3 years ago. They're probably still not back to the level they were prior to that. And, it's something you didn't have to pay attention to now, but it is a reality of the business.
I mean, we're looking at it a quarterly basis with our IT teams, but the crazy thing about cyber resilience is as soon as you put a patch in place to prevent it from happening, there's someone else there creating the next hack, right? So it's a never-ending process, and it's not always just around things that you're doing within your organization or your suppliers doing within their organization, right? If you think about, I guess, the mobile phones a couple months ago, right, where they went out for half a day. Well, we had sales guys that were working projects, and it kind of took you out of communication. And we've also had cyber attacks on our voice over IP for one of our sites that took all the phone lines out. So it wasn't anything that we did; it was a provider that we dealt with that was experiencing a cyber attack. But I think everybody just has a responsibility to make sure that you're putting whatever safeguards you can put in place. But it's just like another pandemic or another country that goes flop or another supplier that goes flop. It's the unknown. So have a contingency plan for everything. So even if it does get hacked, that I can go back to paper, right? I mean, that's the one really, really scary part about technology that from the manufacturing world that they talk about is like, what happens if it collapses? Yeah, everybody forgot how to run a business off of paper. They forgot how to do paper scheduling, right?
Yeah. And I think the world in general is learning more and more. I mean, if any of you are doing business in the UK, we've got a UK operation. Now there are mandates for third-party certifications around this exact thing. And it's not that they're all bad. We're learning a lot from those third-party certifiers.
I think it's the human element too, because there was the big hack of the MGM casinos a couple of years ago that cost, millions and millions of dollars. But the way that these, the cyber attackers got in is they impersonated someone on their IT team by looking at their LinkedIn profile, called the customer service hotline, and was able to get through with just basic information that was on, that employee's LinkedIn profile, and it shut down casinos, all in Vegas, and it's the impact is the human element side of things when it comes to cybersecurity too. Next question.
All right, so this is around human resources. Post-pandemic, have you implemented different strategies for employee retention?
Good question.
Oh yeah, I mean, we've talked about that several little brief points, but a lot around adding value to the employee, right? They're an asset. They're, hey, again, you may train them up and they may be really superpower and they may leave you. But that's a risk you got to take. But it's all about adding value back to the employee. It's not the old pizza party. It's not this little pat on the back. I know this morning he said, hey, the employee of the week, that's great. Guess what? It's really not. Because if you got 10,000 employees and there's one that was the employee of the week, guess what? There was 9,999 that feel shaded because they weren't never going to make that list, right? So why even try? So I think it's about looking at each individual employee, asking that employee kind of what they aspire to be, where they want to be, what they want to do, right? It might be a welder on the floor that says, I really want to get into engineering, and you help them find a pathway to get to what their dream job is. So people just want to be heard, right? And if you don't retain them, you got to listen to them.
Yeah, and I think, a lot of why people come to work, as you mentioned earlier, it's pay and benefits, right? But we're responsible for creating the environment once they get there. And, everybody's not going to be overly pleased with where their pay and benefits are. There's always going to be something better or something that says they're better. But if you have the environment there where people appreciate the environment, it's clean, it's safe, they like the people they're working with, It's a big deal. And, one of the things that we do, we've got an intersect, our intranet site within our company. It flashes up every day. It changes on who has a work anniversary and whose birthday it is. And, for me, for the folks that are in my divisions, every one of those folks that has a work anniversary or a birthday, I send them an IM every morning. And, some of them I don't even know, right? And have not had a chance to meet. But when you do go to the site, and I hear it all the time of, hey, I can't believe you remember it as my birthday. Well, I didn't remember it's your birthday, but it's right there in front of me, right? But it means something to a lot of people.
And I think, too, coming from the logistics side of things, specifically with truckers, acknowledging their wives as well is one key point, I think, in the logistics industry that has helped it a lot, because these truckers are out on the road all the time, so it's very much, it's up to the wives at home to handle the house and everything that goes along with that. And so acknowledging, different companies acknowledging the wives as well, we've seen a really dramatic reception to that.
It's interesting.
I think trucking was hit hardest with retention.
Yes.
Maybe not just leaving, but leaving one mode for a different mode, right? I mean, we talked about a lot of LTL carriers when LA Long Beach was backed up. They're like, man, I can make a lot more money just sitting in my truck waiting for a container to come off at the longshoreman. So, that one's the really creative one, because no matter what, you don't really change a whole lot about that environment. It's wheels and a gas pedal, right?
It's a tough life, and very, very much impacts your own health, and plus the health of your family as well. I think we have time for one more question.
All right, so, and I think we expected this question. Do you anticipate lead times for electrical equipment to go back to the historically typical lead times, specifically for transformers or switchgear?
Absolutely not. I mean, I can't make it any clearer. It's just not. As we continue to try to solve the problems around electrical gear, new problems will get created. There's fragility around, I don't know if you guys saw Peter's view yesterday on electrical steel, right? It's fragile, it's glass. But I think what happened is, what really has compounded this, and if it does come back, it'll be a decade to come back. And it's because before the pandemic, there was a high peak load of electrical equipment that you would ever need. Post the pandemic, we were already starving the global supply chain, but the demand was 4x the capacity. So as you're trying to increase capacity through very long capital equipment that you can't get because of steel and electronics and motors and all these other things, you're still trying to meet the current demand. So all we keep doing by the whole great post-pandemic panic buy was just elongate the solution out times 10. So I don't think we'll ever see it come completely back to where, medium voltage transformers are being stocked or they have all the equipment that they need to be able to throw one together in 4 weeks. I think those days are gone. They were gone a decade ago, right? When solar hit and started doing a supplemental utilization of medium voltage transformers. It's never recovered, and we just keep impacting it because we haven't increased the capacity to manufacture, but we keep trying to request more and more off the draw.
Yeah, I think it gets better. I think it takes a while to get back to where it was, 5, 6, 8 years ago. But there's a lot of people that have left the space, a lot of manufacturers that have left the space. There's a lot of consolidation that's happened in the industry. But especially a lot of the major manufacturers out there today, they're putting a lot of money into new facilities and new equipment. Like I said earlier, it'll be 2 or 3 years before they get online. That will make a difference, but the consumption is there today. It'll take a while to get caught up.
Well, I think Eaton just announced they're going to do $500 million in capital in the next 5 years just to try to reduce lead time. Right. But ask them if they'll guarantee they'll be back. The answer is absolutely not. Right. Because there's so many unknowns as you still try to invest in capital to improve your manufacturing operation. There's still hits and misses. Right. But that's a really good question. I think it kind of reflects back on is inflation ever going to come back to 1%? No, it's not going to do that either.
Well, as you can tell, managing and de-risking your supply chain is full of complexities. They are probably never going to go away. So these are issues that we are going to have to constantly evolve on to find different solutions. But I want to thank Phil and Fred. Thank you for your perspective, and thank you for the conversation around this topic. For the rest of you in the audience, thank you so much for sticking with us. I know it's tough for the second day of the conference, and especially around lunchtime. So appreciate your time and attention, and we should be available afterwards if you have any questions or have any comments. So thank you.
Thank you, Blythe. Thanks, everybody.